What you just said right there is so key. You can act with urgency without being fearful.
Yeah.
See that, and everyone is waiting for that. Everyone is waiting for someone who can come to a situation and do that. Nobody's waiting for a person who's just like, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it, guys. That's not helpful because you're actually facing a difficult situation. What you're looking for is someone who can come in with a certain calmness because of mastery, not a calmness because they don't care.
Welcome to the Inspirit podcast from Amoris Christi. Join us as we explore current events and all manner of fascinating topics and explore their connections to Christian living.
How's this week been for you guys? Well, I guess we just recorded
this
to the top of the week, but
it's been cold.
It's been colder.
It's very cold when we're recording.
Yeah, and iguana's starting to fall, so it's actually coming true.
What about you, Anthony? Are you holding up okay? Keeping insulated,
hanging in there. Yeah, actually, so our chapel doesn't have air conditioning. I mean, heat. I didn't realize that. So it was like 58 degrees in the morning for mass today, but it's pretty cool.
I've seen Anthony shiver when it was like 70 degrees outside. Seriously.
Yeah, I remember that in Tampa, right? Yeah, yep. I always remember that.
I like cold weather, so I had a bonfire in my backyard yesterday.
Oh, no way.
Wow.
Oh, man, it was so nice. Never get to do that.
S'mores?
We didn't have the marshmallows, so just sat there burning the fire down.
Okay.
But it was fun.
Well, talking about fires and falling iguanas.
Sounds dangerous.
Yeah, sounds
scary.
Sounds fearful. But yeah, I think even this past Saturday on the Feast of John Bosco, the gospel we read about, why are you terrified? Is it not I? So I think, we were thinking about talking about fear. And because we've seen the many effects that fear has on so many people, young people, any age, even at this age, we continue to struggle with fear, and it can often stand in the way of us coming to the fullness of who we are. And so just wanted to talk a little bit about that today, about fear. And so, how do you guys kind of see that as, the obstacles that fear portrays for us as a human person?
It's a fundamental part of being human. Not that it's necessarily like something that you should always have in your life or something, but everyone knows the experience of being afraid. Although that does bring up a question. I'll counter your question with a question. Is fear always a bad thing? Yeah,
there's a healthy fear, and there is a physiological response to fear in many ways, right? Like, like we talk about the flight or fight response. So fear in many ways can be our human on a human physiology level, biology level. It's protecting us from danger. So there is a healthy fear in that. And so many times, when we notice, when our body recognizes danger, even before we start thinking about it, our brain starts processing it. So there's a part of your brain called the amygdala, which in a way processes fear for you. And usually many times when our brain processes things, it goes, there's connections made to the prefrontal cortex is where thinking, reasoning all happen. So that's you can think of that as the front of your brain. But what happens in fear, and even sometimes in overwhelming emotions as well, what happens is you're not able to, it's like even before those connections are made, the amygdala starts triggering a response in your body.
Right.
And that's for protection because, sometimes when you're in that much kind of fear, you need to respond because it's trying to protect you from something important. So that in a way can activate what we call the nervous systems, autonomic nervous systems, which we talked a little bit about in the stress episodes, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which manages your heart rate, increase blood supply, whatever you need to protect you in a way. That's what happens. So that's, I would say, like as a physiological response, that is what fear is. So you see, a bear, and there's fear that needs to kick in because otherwise you can't run away or you can't respond to that. So
if you didn't have this natural biological mechanism inside, like you probably wouldn't last very long.
Yeah.
Even just thinking of like a natural disaster or a fire, like and knowing instinctively, like, I need to get away from that.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that, I guess we'll call it like that very neutral biological level of fear, where it's like something that's in us on like a primal level. And then, of course, when we talk about spiritual language, a lot of times we frame fear in a negative way, understandably. I'm thinking of the passage from 1 John, that perfect love drives out all fear. So fear is something that's held in antithesis to love.
Oh yeah, I guess even in scripture, then, I think there is a need to distinguish the fears as well.
Right, because scripture also has fear of the Lord.
Yeah, so maybe, but in a way, so there is a healthy fear.
Right.
And there is what we call, a crippling fear, which
Unhealthy.
we see in everyday life.
Yeah.
And so it's good to, I guess, distinguish that. But how do we kind of see the crippling fear that?
Yeah, how do we distinguish that?
I mean, when we look at animals, you see the prevalence of fear in their daily lives. I think that, like you both are saying, sometimes we have this desire to be rid of all fears, or if we experience fear in a given moment, we just really don't like it, and we, especially with maybe some of the trends of self-help and well-being or Zen and stuff like that, we're trying to eliminate all fear. But you just observe any animal, and there's going to be a lot of fear, because, for example, if there's a bird flying above you, so, or even the shadow of a bird or something like that, it's like, oh, there could be a predator above me, and so different noises, when you walk and you'll see the animals suddenly turn at you, that's a fear response.
Right.
They're getting ready to run if they have to. So that's one side of things. Is like, okay, in some ways we have to recognize how normal fear is, and like you said, the important function it plays in our survival, both physically, but even socially, right?
Yeah.
It plays an important role in our survival. Like, you don't want to do things that would have result in you being ostracized from a community or something like that.
Right. Or on the flip side, somebody who seems like a little bit strange or dangerous, like, if you didn't have a sense of that, like, again, that also is protecting yourself.
Yeah. And but then there's the other reality, which is equally real, which is, I think, what the scriptures are primarily referring to, that in our lives, each one of us here and everyone out there, there's a very real way in which fear blocks us, has inhibited us from coming to the fullness of who we are meant to be, who we're called to be, and experiencing the joy that the Lord desires for us to experience every day, and that's very real. And I think because we are such lofty beings, in a sense, that's so much more important. In a sense, maybe Scripture takes for granted that, there's the ordinary fear of a kind of an animal fear, which is normal, but this is the critical point that we want to focus on. Like, the Lord wants you to be free of fear, and specifically that passage I think is interesting in 1 John, because it's placed in the context of condemnation. That we are afraid of being condemned, and St. John is saying that when there's perfect love, that fear, you're set free from that fear.
Right. You'll never be turned away. Even as we're talking about it, what I'm reminded of is how, a lot of our human emotions exist on, I guess you could call it a sort of sliding scale, which tends to have these two poles, one way or the other way. And one of those sliders when it comes to emotion is attraction and aversion. Like, for instance, happiness we associate more with like being pulled towards something. Sadness would be an aversion away from something. Fear is a kind of aversion when we're talking about it as an emotion. And being averse to things in itself is not good or bad in itself, right? Because I might have an aversion to something, like, I don't know, maybe I personally have an aversion to canned tuna, right? And I'm not afraid of it, but I have an aversion to it. And fear is one of those aversion mechanisms that's in us. And I think a lot of times the way to distinguish, or one way to distinguish an unhealthy versus a very natural or even healthy fear, is to ask, what is this making me averse to? What am I being repelled from when I experience this? And like, is that rational? Is that reasonable? Is that healthy? Because you might have a very good fear of tidal waves, unless you happen to live in the desert. But that aversion makes perfect sense. Or I'm afraid of getting hit in the face. Yeah. Like, so I'm going to duck when somebody like swings at me. That doesn't really happen, but that's very natural aversion, right? But then if I'm like, I'm afraid of my friends, or I'm afraid that my friends will reject me.
Well, it's interesting because, even in that example, it still can make sense.
It can.
Yeah. In fact, I think it's safe to presume that fears always make sense in some way, right? And I want to qualify that, of course, because I agree with what you're saying. It's just that, like, if we look into the genesis of the fear, it makes sense. For example, if a person is afraid of friends, and if you really just were curious about it, it must be because of betrayals or hurts or things like that they've experienced in either with friendships or with analogous relationships. And our emotional response, like you said, it's not really like the thinking kind. It's the intuitive kind. Yeah. It's the instantaneous intuitive kind. And therefore it makes associations, which in some cases would probably take us a very long time to do by thinking about it. If at all we can even do that. You know how it is. I mean, sometimes intuition gives you perspective that would be very hard to attain otherwise, right? In a given situation, like you can sense like something's off about that guy. I don't know. Yeah. There's something funny about him. And somebody says, what is it? I can't. That's the intuition there, which is very powerful. And so the fear as an intuition to protect you from harm generally makes sense in some way. But I think the question is, one, is there something greater that maybe makes this threat worth it, or makes the possibility of this threat worth it? That's very real, right? Because, for example, if you want to do something big, or take some big initiative or try something new, as
hike a mountain.
Okay,
maybe not what Father Thomas would do. But.
Yeah, no, not me. No, I don't know how that would be worth it, I guess. But like, if you're trying to take some daring move in your career or something like that, or some people sometimes middle of life, they say, I really feel like I'm being called to go to some higher studies or something like that. It's like, and all these fears come up. What if I can't do it? What if I fail? Okay, those are real risks. They make sense. In different ways. You could lose a lot of money, and you could lose a lot of time for no benefit and everything. But there's different ways in which we have to work through the fear. I think that's kind of the point, is we have to listen to the fear, see what it's about, and then we have to work through it to say whether, one, does this intuition genuinely apply to this situation, or is it being misapplied or overgeneralized?
Right. Or is it like a source of disordered thinking somewhere? Like, am I making obviously it's intuition, and intuition is incredibly valuable, but because we're not seeing the connections that are being made under the surface, sometimes we almost have to elevate those above the surface.
Oh, yeah.
And be like, is A really connecting to B, connecting to C, or is there something that's like misaligned here?
Exactly. And that's the overgeneralization problem when it comes to fear. Because, for example, John hurt me when I was 10. And so now I have a very hard time trusting Chris, because because of what John did to me. So it's not necessarily that it's wrong or disordered. In some way it makes sense, and in some ways it could be helpful, but it's like it got overgeneralized, to now it's like every single relationship is affected by that, that fear. So recognizing that,
Yeah.
identifying that, and then saying kind of like, wait, does it still apply here? Or when that happened to me, I was 10. I didn't know how to defend myself. I didn't know how. I'm not that 10-year-old anymore. I've built up the mechanisms to actually protect myself, so to mitigate the risk. And there's all kinds of different ways of working through the fear. I mean, that's one of them. I think would be identifying where it's been overgeneralized.
Yeah, but I think even as you're saying, like even naming them as it is, identifying it, I think in a way it makes it lose its power. The power of fear, because like many times, like what you're saying is like it's pre-rational a lot of the time, fear, and we're not able to even name it or think through it, and even just like when you say that, obviously like that John, I don't trust John. I mean, I had a difficult experience with John, and now I can't trust Chris. Immediately, I mean, you're able to work through that, but I think before you're able to identify that your experience with John is what's defining how you relate to another person now, then it becomes so hard. So I think even just naming it, identifying it has such a powerful role.
Because if you don't do that, you're just acting out of these cycles of behavior that you don't understand.
Yeah.
And so you act in ways that are strange even to yourself, to other people sometimes. And, we might end up doing things that make us go, why did I react that way?
Yeah, exactly. Why is that? Why do you think fear has such a crippling power over us?
Oh, because it's very powerful because it protects us and saves our lives,
From the risk you're saying, or from moving forward?
Yeah, from the risks of life. I mean, that's why I think if you it's not a good idea to if you could just unplug your fear, it still wouldn't be a good idea.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that's what sometimes people do, with alcohol and such. They call it liquid courage, right? Because it inhibits your inhibitions, and so even though you're afraid, you don't feel the inhibition of the fear and you go forward or whatever.
You know what it reminds me of, though? Like what we're talking about with fear is medicine. Like when you take medicine in a small dose, like it heals you, but when you take the same medicine in larger dose, it's a poison. And so fear in the healthy sense of an aversion to things that would harm me, that's, reasonable and understood to whatever degree it needs to be. It's like taking a medicine, like it's protecting myself. But, as they sometimes say, the dose makes the poison. If you were to take too much painkiller, you could get incredibly, incredibly sick or die. And I think fear is like that too. You can overdose on it. You can let your life be ruled by it. And so instead of it being something that's meant to protect you, almost like inoculate you against harmful situations, like it in itself becomes something harmful and just self-destructive.
Yeah, because, fears are so powerful, right? Because the aversions are more important than the attractions in life, right? Because, for example, if, like, to use the distinction you were talking about, like if I'm just walking along on the edge of a cliff, enjoying the view, if I don't feel that terrifying fear of when when you're on a height and you perceive that there's a big fall in front of you, you feel something like throughout your whole system. If you don't feel that fear, just one little mistake, and then your whole life is over. Whereas that can't happen on the flip side with attractions. You know what I mean? So that's there isn't this one thing you could do which would then make you like not die forever, So that's the reason why we experience fear much more powerfully, I think, than the attractions. It's more immediate. It's kind of has a seizing effect on us. Yeah. So I think that the other way so one would be like, checking if it's overgeneralized, but the other way is by actually accounting for the risks and mitigating them in different ways. Like, for example, if to take that simple example there, I mean, if you see that height and then you're afraid, but then it's like, okay, you walk along where there's a rail or something like that, but more practically in life, the way we do that is usually by developing skills. So, for example, if you're afraid, let's say you're a new teacher and you're terrified about going in front of the class and teaching and all this stuff, or at work, you have to give a presentation. And so one of the ways in which you mitigate that risk, what's the risk? The risk is that you'll be just a bumbling idiot up there, and I don't know what to say, or you'll make mistakes. That's what we feel, that's what the fear is. And I don't want to look like a fool in front of my colleagues and all that stuff. So what do? You practice, you prepare, and generally the more you practice and the more you prepare, the less you'll feel afraid, because you've actually mitigated the risk of such a failure. It's not that it's impossible that you will fail, but it becomes less and less likely. So if you take different speaking engagements and you try talking in front of different people, the fear will start to dissipate. In most cases, I mean, unless it's like a clinical or something like that, and maybe there'll be special cases. But so that's another way in which we can also work through fear, through skill development.
Mm-hmm. What does kind of some of the everyday fears look like for people, like based on what you guys worked with, or based on what you guys have seen? What are like different ways these fears are not manifested, but what are the kind of fears, I guess, that you've seen?
Social fears are huge. Social fears, meaning putting yourself out there to the public in some way, shape, or form. I think.
Is that a fear of rejection and judgment, you would say, or is it something more?
Good question.
It could be. I think the most common type of fear, in my opinion, is a fear of something unknown, even fear of the unknown itself. Generally, there's something that we're not seeing. That's why people a lot of times try very hard to understand and control in response to their fears.
Yeah.
Is because control and understanding are ways of sort of exercising our mind or our will over things that make us afraid. So if somebody, for instance, is afraid of rejection in social relationships, to use that example, a lot of times an unhealthy way that people will respond to that is by attempting to control those relationships, which is not a good thing. Or, for instance, somebody might be, let's take like a less unhealthy example. Somebody might be afraid of the dark, like if they're a little kid, right? And what do mom or dad do a lot of the times when a kid's afraid of the dark? They'll like flip on the light and see, and they'll say, "See, look, there's nothing there."
Yeah.
Once you see it, once you know it's there, the fear loses its power. So a lot of times I think there's an unknowing that goes along with it. Not all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that seems to be like one of the broad classes of fears is this fear of something unknown, unseen, not able to be controlled.
Yeah. I also think about fear of failure a lot. Yeah. Like, like say you want to do something, something good, but you're afraid that if you'll fail. And I think what happens is also then you're not just saying what I did was a failure. It becomes now I have become a failure,
Right. So
and
it points to a deeper fear.
Yeah, it's probably, I think, shame too. Like we've talked about that with Sunil as well on that shame episode of like, it's no longer what I did was a failure. It's I am a failure. So
and even there, it's it's tricky and it's nuanced, because imagine if you didn't have that fear of failure.
Yeah.
And I mean, Jesus talks about if you're going to build a tower and you don't, assess the costs before you begin building, right? Is that how it goes? I think so.
More or less.
There's two examples he gives, right? One is if you're going out to battle,
right.
And then, the other one's, I think, if you're building a tower. So if you didn't have the fear of failure, you would just, let me just attempt these different things. You know, I mean, like, let me start a nonprofit and borrow money from all kinds of people, or start a business and ask all these people to invest in it. But I'm not really afraid of it failing, Well, what'll end up happening is you'll become a person with a kind of a serial failing person, without any fear of failure. Now, I'm not saying there's people out there like that necessarily. I'm saying, like, even here, we don't want to unplug the fear.
Yeah.
You know, even though, but fear of failure can hold us back from so many good things. The solution isn't, okay, we want to eliminate the fear. Maybe we can explore that together. I mean,
yeah, what does a
like
healthy relationship with fear look like?
Yeah, or
right?
even to be concrete with fear of failure, because that is so universal.
Yeah, I think that fear of failure needs to ultimately be almost transformed into more an awareness of the cost. Awareness is not necessarily fear. So, for instance, like in the example that Jesus gives in the scripture that you mentioned, I don't think Jesus is advocating for being afraid in those scenarios. It might start that way in our human experience, but I think that ends up translating in the end to an awareness of what needs to happen if this can't go through. What do I need to do?
Yeah, I kind of see it as like what you're saying similarly too, as like the fear is not what's defining what makes your next decision.
Right.
You're aware of it and you're aware of the consequences of it, but the fear shouldn't be the primary motivation for you to make the decision. That's kind of how I see it.
I think that's like one of the litmus tests for it, if fear has gone too far, is like, is fear the motive? Like a lot of times, motive for my actions is what I mean to say. A lot of times, if somebody's acting out of fear, especially in the spiritual life, we'll categorically say like, ooh, there's something not right there. Like, you know, you need to go back to something and discern it there because, you know, something's gone awry. So yeah, that's definitely the point where I would say fear has almost gone too far is when it actually becomes the primary motivating factor for your behavior and your decisions, especially spiritual decisions. I don't know. Fear of failure though. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking back to Anthony's question, and I don't know if I have a clear answer to it.
Any thoughts, Father, on how our relationship should with fear be?
Yeah, so I think in general with fear, so let's say fear of failure, as you mentioned, Anthony, we want to name it. And one, that's because it can lose a certain type of power over us that comes from being vague and nebulous. You know, generally anything that's vague and nebulous is terrifying, right? Like being in a dark room, you know, so when you name it, that helps. But then I think that there has to be a process of actually working through it. For example, I acknowledge the risk. I acknowledge the potential threats. Like, actually, it is true. I could fail at this. And what would that mean? You know, in other words, you're facing your fears. You're kind of looking at them dead in the eye, you know, and then you're trying to assess whether, even though those risks are there, I've prepared well for this, or I've planned for this, I've accounted for this. You know, sometimes especially when you're like a little bit younger and you're very excited and ambitious and all that stuff, but yeah, it's just not everything is fully, you know, developed in that sense. So, you know, there can be a tendency for excessive risk taking. Yeah. Right. And I think that part of it is, you know, that older people help to bridge a gap is to say, you know, okay, have you thought about this? Like, okay, let's say you have a family or something like that. You have a family. Like, what if this doesn't work out? You know, so I don't think we're trying to eliminate the fear of failure. I think what we want to do is acknowledge the fear of failure, which is meant to protect you, and then to see whether you can overcome those threats, you know, whether you can mitigate those risks and stuff like that. Now, in the spiritual sense, the beauty of our relationship with the Lord is that there is an ultimate sense, a felt and deeply known sense of the providence of the Father, so that my life isn't left to chance, right? Which is the ultimate form of the unknown. Like, if the unknown is terrifying and uncertain future, the ultimate sense of the unknown is my life is left completely to chance, basically. Like, you know,
just the chaos of the universe.
The chaos of the universe, and that's it. But for a Christian, the ultimate reality is one of logos, it's one of meaning, it's one of God's plan and purpose, which is universal, but also for me personally, like I know he has made promises to me. He has, revealed himself to me. He has a plan for me. I'm chosen. So that the ground that gives is actually very powerful.
Yeah.
Actually, if we're secure in that deepest sense, it can actually allow us to appreciate the lesser forms of fear and kind of allow them to play their function, because they never become that deep, existential fear.
Yeah,
Right.
rooted in God's faithfulness to us, right? Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
You guys have any examples of, different times you've faced fears and how you've kind of processed them and, worked with them and grown out of it? Or
You were sharing something a little earlier about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think through what I've often called one of God's practical jokes. Like, there was a period in my life where I was pretty active on social media, and then something went viral, and there was a lot of attention on me. There's a lot of media attention on me, and at first I really did not want that. I didn't want it at all. I was, in general, I'm a private person, and especially on social media, I tend to be very private, and I had completely quit social media twice before. So then all of a sudden, when there was 100,000 or 1 million different eyes on me, and really feeling that, I prayed with that, and I realized what that was actually was fear. And in my case, it wasn't fear of starting up a social media project or something. It was really, I realized it was fear of the world. So when I prayed, I remember distinctly, because the day was the liturgical feast of the Korean martyrs, St. Andrew, Kim Taegon, and companions, in the office of readings for his feast. And I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but St. Andrew, Kim Taegon, is writing from prison, and he says something to the effect of, "Do not be afraid, little flock, to do battle bravely in the world and conquer the demonic foe that Christ has already conquered." And I sat with that, and that was such an encouragement to me, and I didn't even understand why at first. But then I realized what it really was this fear. What I was afraid of, actually, was just getting swallowed up in a shallow world. Social media can be so devoid of meaning. It can be very envious. It can be very self-centered, and not wanting to get lost in that. So when I read those words, what I really felt very firmly from the Lord after that was, I will never let that happen to you. That God would protect me from that. And that really formed my relationship with social media for the time I really was acting as a social media personality. It drove me towards always seeking authenticity and engaging with people genuinely. And trying to offer something of value, not just cheap entertainment. So I think it was really important that it began with that acknowledgement of I'm afraid of something here, and what is that? And then how is the Lord responding to that and bringing truth into that? So that really transforms the experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
Awesome.
yeah, that's awesome. I think, in a way that fear became transformative for you, and I think that's in a way that what we talked about, a healthy relationship with fear. But even I think that's a good starting point, right? Bringing it to the Lord, of bringing your fears, naming it, and then even if you don't know how to name it, of this is what I'm going through, and bringing it to the Lord.
Right. Help me out. Where's this coming from?
Yeah. And and I think so many times in the Gospels, it's do not be afraid.
Oh yeah.
Do not be afraid,
Over and over and over.
And even we were just talking about before the episodes, St. John Paul II, that was one of his most powerful messages.
Do not be afraid. That deep voice.
That meant the world to me when I was in high school, listening to him, St. John Paul II, saying that to young people in particular. And I don't, we didn't have YouTube at that time. So it wasn't even I was listening to him or watching videos of him per se, but just reading the different messages that were written. We did have the internet at that time, so
Dial-up. But there's no YouTube probably, right?
Yeah, there's no YouTube, but it was like, all right, reading these messages, it was like, wow, and I remember there was some Catholic magazine that used to come to my house, I forget which one, and a beautiful picture of him on it, and so I'd like have that picture up in my room, and like reading him say, do not be afraid. That's the existential fear. That was more speaking into the existential fear of, you're made for great things. The Lord has chosen and called you and blessed you, and even amidst the struggles of life and everything. And sometimes the struggles of life are not like even some particular thing that that you're facing, right? But it's just even the search for meaning in life and all of that. So amidst all of that, it's just like, do not be afraid. Like, put out into the deep. That was his other thing.
Open wide the doors.
Open wide the doors.
To Christ.
Just, powerful stuff.
As you're sharing, Father, it kind of reminded me a little bit of the sort of nebulous relationship between fear and anxiety. Not speaking clinically, of course, but just in our common everyday use. Like, sometimes it's hard to draw a line between what is just fear and what is anxiety. And it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek definition, but the definition of anxiety I often think of is anxiety is fear of nothing in particular. Because fear generally is fear of something. You're afraid of the dark. You're afraid of spiders. You're afraid of losing your job. Like, there's all these different things that you're afraid of. Fear points to something. But anxiety is almost like fear that's lost its object. Like, it doesn't have one. Like, it's vague. And so even earlier in the episode when you mentioned how fear can become generalized, I think that's really when fear begins to cross the threshold into anxiety. And even when we talk of existential fears, like, those easily can cross that threshold into anxiety because they just they cover so much of a person's life, those deep existential questions. So
when you guys say existential questions, you're talking about like,
why am I here? What is my purpose? Yeah.
And to those questions is what St. John Paul II and Jesus, are you guys saying, like, is speaking towards when he says, do not be afraid, right?
In a sense, yes. Yeah. But maybe, I don't know that that's necessarily anxiety. Like, for example, if a person has existential fear, they may not be anxious at all. They may not have any actual anxiety, because what we're talking about here is really not at the level of psychology anymore.
Yeah, it's not crippling or anything.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. They could be very functional and all that stuff. I mean, and on the flip side, a person without existential fear could experience anxiety. And anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing, because, for example, if you're in a time of in life where you have to be especially attentive to threats, like, for example, if you have your first little baby or something like that, you're a mom, you might be more anxious in general. And that's just to be more attentive to threats, because you have something very vulnerable and you're not used to taking care of something so fragile and all that stuff, So there could be some positive roles for anxiety as well. But of course, all these things are all interrelated.
Yeah, I don't think we'd want to throw away wholesale anything in our human experience. But, one thing I think I can at least immediately agree on with what you said is that anxiety shouldn't be normative. Meaning, that is to say, like, there might be times where anxiety has a place, but it's not a normative way of being.
Yeah. Again, it just depends on how much we're talking about. Like, if you were completely devoid of anxiety, that might not be generally a good thing. It's sort of like the sensitivity of your skin. If it's like very sensitive, then it's like, every little thing's like, ouch, that you're kind of like a very weak person, But if you're not sensitive at all, you're probably going to have all kinds of cuts on you.
Well, it draws me back in a certain way to the analogy, again, that I mentioned before, where fear is a bit like taking a medicine, but the dose makes the poison.
Yeah, exactly,
and I think in some sense, from extending the analogy, anxiety is almost like an even more powerful medicine, where you just got to really measure those doses. Because even just a little bit more than that, and like, it can just wreak absolute havoc on a person's life. And I mean, I think everybody today knows at least one person who struggles with clinical anxiety.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a huge problem. So certainly wouldn't advocate for anxious living, but, in a very limited, small dosage, I could see that it might have a purpose.
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges I've noticed about fear is that it makes everything urgent. Like you have this fear
that's a
of
great
like
point.
like say you want to put out something on social media. So you have this fear of like, oh, what's going to happen? Maybe it's fear of the unknown, fear of rejection, fear of judgment, whatever it is. But then it starts making like what you're experiencing like right now. This is like crippling you right now.
Like you got to do this
rather
now.
than allowing you to think through
Right.
what is going to happen. So I think that for me is like one of the challenges I've noticed. Like it turns everything into like urgency, like whatever you're experiencing into urgency as well.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, that's like
everything feels immediate. You know?
Yeah. And everything feels like rushed and stressful, and everything seems to be bombarding you. And then of course that can like really quickly break away from the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
And you start to spiral.
Yeah. And that's talking about spiraling too. And that's why I think like having even someone to talk through your fears is so helpful, because I think fear, when it's done in isolation, you're going down like another spiral, you know?
Right.
And so even just having like a mentor or another person with a little bit of wisdom to like help you guide through this process, in a way, I think it helps you name the fear. And I think it also takes away the crippling effect of it, but also at the same time have a healthy relationship with fear as well.
Yeah, fear is definitely one of those things where you got to maintain proper distance, like almost like keeping it at arm's length, because of I think what you mentioned too, Anthony, how it makes things feel more immediate, more pressing, and that's a lot of ripe opportunity for irrational thinking. And you know, again, speaking in spiritual terms, like the enemy knows that too. That's why a lot of times in discernment, there's usually a lot of counsel to be gentle, to be patient, to wait, because the enemy is trying to rush you and push you and stress you out. Because in our human frailty, like it's very easy to make irrational decisions when we have to make them really quickly, and unbridled fear definitely can move us towards that.
You were talking about how when there's somebody with you, it can help you to overcome the fear. That's one of the most clinically effective ways of helping people overcome phobias. You know, you essentially, what you want is for the person to have mastery experiences. So like if a person has a fear of heights, then, you know, maybe even approaching an elevator would be terrifying, you know. And so one is you want to have mastery experiences through small steps. Like, okay, what if we just get in the elevator and get out? You know, we don't go up on the elevator. And then you come back and you realize, oh, I was able to do that, you know. And it's not necessarily a conscious thing, but it sort of reprograms your fear pathways, I guess. And but one of the ways that is very effective in doing that is that initially the therapist would accompany the person. Like, here, how about we walk up this hill together and we come down, and we do this together and come down. And then you slowly let the person do it on their own and stuff like that. Now that's used, I'm talking in a clinical sense here, but I'm blanking on his name right now of where I'm getting this from. But anyway, but even outside of clinical experiences in all of our professions and, you know, different things like that, like that's how you overcome fear. You know, I mean, somebody walks you through it and somebody's there with you and stuff like that. So it's not all on you. In other words, it's sort of like when you go to driving school or whatever, you know, and you have the person next to you and they can slam the brakes if they need to. So you're not going to die, you know, because if you're afraid of driving because you don't know how to drive, that's a really good fear to have because otherwise you can end up dead, you know, pretty easily. But when you're with somebody else right there and he says, okay, don't worry, let's try this out. You know, he can slam on the brakes if he needs to, or he can instruct you on what to do in a situation that you haven't encountered before. And then you're learning. So that's the skill development, right? You're learning while at the same time you're not being crippled by fear because there's somebody there with you. And I think in general, like in life, that if we can also be that for other people, you
absolutely,
know, I mean, in the broad sense of navigating life, of changes in life, professions, marriage, vocation. Like if we can be that for other people, like that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, because I also think like talking about accompanying other people, like I have seen places where fear can be contagious too. Like if you're fearful in like your accompaniment of another person, that fear then starts to spill over into other people in that community too. And so so I do think like that is very important of like, why, because I often think about like my mentors or people in medicine oftentimes, right? And like, when they're in an acute situation or when they're in like a high level situation, if they're showing fear and, if they're expressing fear, then the whole room and who they're leading is responding with fear. But then their way of like, even you can act with urgency without being fearful too. And so their way of going about things really, like, I think that helped me a lot in seeing the influence of one person's fear on the rest of the community too.
What you just said right there is so key. You can act with urgency without being fearful.
Yeah.
See that, and everyone is waiting for that. Everyone is waiting for someone who can come to a situation and do that. Nobody's waiting for a person who's just like, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it, guys. That's not helpful because you're actually facing a difficult situation. What you're looking for is someone who can come in with a certain calmness because of mastery, not a calmness because they don't care, but where they can say, okay, here's what we're going to do to, deal with this situation. All of a sudden you'll see the fear dissipate from the room,
Right. It goes back to that earlier thing, how a lot of times the way that we attempt to respond to fear is through understanding or control. Of course, that can happen in unhealthy ways, but that is a healthy way.
Right.
Is like what you mentioned about mastery. Like when somebody who has a good, firm mental grasp of what's going on is able to respond to it without, spiraling or acting irrationally, then other people see that and they say, okay, he has the situation under control. Right. So, that lowers the fear level. And, I mean, you see this in business and politics and many different sectors of life, how even if the person in charge has no idea what like he or she is actually doing, as long as he can at least present that he knows what he's doing or she knows what she's doing.
But that doesn't last long. I mean,
no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And people catch on to it,
right.
But that's why I'm laughing.
Right.
But of course, like, even that can be enough to assuage fears. Sure. And, that's, there's been moments in history where like very dicey situations have had to be navigated with that sort of like, it's okay, everybody, things are under control.
Yeah.
Like navigating that, it's very tricky. Like I can think of concrete events, but it takes a certain skill.
Oh, by the way, the guy's name I was thinking of was Albert Bandura. That's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
That was on
right
the
on the top
clinical.
Like the self-mastery experiences and all that stuff. Another interesting thing, just if I can go on a little bit of maybe as a tangent, I don't know, but is sometimes as people become more effective in life, step up into greater influence, leadership and everything, their fear can actually increase, which is kind of counterintuitive because a lot of the fears we're talking about are about myself. Like, I don't want to be harmed. I don't want to be all that stuff. But as you grow in leadership, you care for other people, for institutions, for the church, for the world at large and stuff like that. And you can care for your family, for your children. You can care in such a way that you could actually become fearful of, harm befalling them or things not going in the best way or whatever. It's like the opposite from the person who is perennially just like like a child and never takes responsibility or ownership for something and therefore never experiences the fears associated with it. But when you take on responsibility, if you've genuinely taken it and if you own it, you will feel the fear that's connected with it. And again, as long as that fear is translated in the right way, processed in the right way, it can actually be a very good thing. So I think some of the most effective people in the world would experience fear. at a large level, but it's just about how they work through the fear.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one example that immediately comes to my mind is the timeless fear that parents feel towards their children, where they're just, fearful for their children's well-being. And of course, it's part of every child's story of growing up. In general, how, there'll be like, mom, dad, I'll be okay. Like, right. There's like, I'm going to be fine. I'm not going to do anything dumb. Right.
Yeah.
There's these stories that we're all familiar with, probably from our own lives.
I mean, that's still happening in my life. I have to keep telling my parents, I was like, I'm okay. I think I can manage getting on this flight. And text me when you get there. All that stuff, right?
Right. And it always, of course, we know that it comes from genuine loving concern, in general.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that it reminds me of that I always hold in counterbalance, and I've said this to my own parents, is, hey, Jesus commands us not to worry. It's actually one of the few things that Jesus commands us not to do.
To not worry.
Generally, like, there's not a lot of negative commands in the gospel, but that is one of them, is do not worry. Along with do not be afraid. Yeah, do not be anxious about tomorrow. Like, and taken in the right way, of course. But, so even like something as precious as a parent's relationship with their children, that fear cannot ultimately translate into a worrying, into like however that might manifest, right? Like whether it's kind of like a doting, or they'll call it like helicopter parenting.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Like I have on our gambling episode, you had a hot take, Father. My hot take for this episode is these apps where parents can like track their children's locations. Oh, I can't stand them. I think it's so unhealthy.
I didn't know people were doing that.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
Don't people just share their location voluntarily with other people at this point?
Well, I mean, if you do that because like there's some need, I'm not saying it's like a thing in principle, but I think it's more the idea, like I don't remember some of these apps, Chris. But it's like parents like they'll have these apps installed on their kids' phones. They can always track like where they are at any time. And to me, I'm just like, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's like some very specific situations where that's necessary.
I feel kids are too smart. They'll find a way, right? They'll just leave their phone.
It's not even about like getting around
I'm just
it.
joking.
Yeah, but for me, it's not even like, oh, I gotta get around my parents. Like it's not like that for me. It's more just like you are letting worry dominate your life, like towards your child. Like I completely understand like being fearful for your child's safety, especially in light of the events in our world today. I completely understand that.
But in that sense, I feel fear is not about safety. It's about control. Yes.
That's like a fear that has not like resolved in, I think, I would call it a rational decision. I think it's more, it becomes a control thing. Like I just need more control over my kids' lives in order to make sure they're safe. And, what ends up happening as a result is, there's tension in the relationship. It can become bitter. It can become resentful.
And you can actually hinder the full development of the child.
Yeah.
You do, not that you can, because even though it's coming from maybe a good place of wanting to protect the child, overprotection of a child who is in the developmental process is actually very harmful, right?
Yeah.
Because they need to encounter some of the challenges of life and be
face
able
the consequences of them, right?
Well, face consequences too, but like even like, you go somewhere and then, oh no, I forgot my wallet. Well, I need to now think and figure out like how to manage this situation on my own. I can't just immediately call mom and dad for help in every situation. Yeah. Of course, age appropriately, but
like sometimes people will say that this is just like it's just different parenting styles, and obviously many of the people we know are Indian cultural background, so they'll say, well, this is just an Indian parenting thing. I think that
Asian parenting,
Asian parenting, however they might call it.
Well, no, the helicopter parenting thing is universal.
Exactly.
Yeah,
well, that for sure. And then I also think it makes a little too cheap the situation. Like because I can give an example from my own upbringing. Like I'm the oldest, and obviously shockingly I'm not Indian. But growing up, especially because I was the first child, my parents were a lot more restrictive with me. I think that's a common experience with oldest children in general. So growing up, I remember, I wonder if my mom will ever hear this, but growing up, I was allowed to ride my bike only around the block of our neighborhood. So I would do like 30 laps around the block.
I love it.
And my neighbors used to make fun of it. Like they'd be like, "Oh, Chris is out on his bike," and they see me going around over and
Was it
over and
because
over.
you couldn't cross the street?
It was because I couldn't leave the neighborhood. I couldn't go too far from the house.
Okay, okay.
And so eventually, when I was this is in my middle school years. We homeschooled them. My mom gave me a walkie-talkie. And she said it has a 2-mile radius.
Oh, that's smart. I like that.
Stay within range.
Stay within range. If I walkie-talkie you, I need to be able to get in touch with you.
There you go.
And then and so then that became the new rule. And that eventually graduated up to like, well, you can go on bike rides a little farther out, but you got to go with the neighbor. He rode his bike every day, so we'd go on bike rides together. He was a really sweet old guy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was nice.
That's cool.
But that they had to break out of that. Well, fast forward to a few years ago, I went on a hiking trip. I was not afraid of heights. Clearly, like I'm thinking to what you said earlier, Father. I went on a hiking trip to hike a mountain solo, which is actually pretty dangerous. And I had to do all the research ahead of time. I had to get an emergency beacon in case something went wrong.
See, that's the mitigating the risks part. That's
Yeah,
good.
and thankfully I didn't have to use it. But, I had to train for it. I had to understand what to do based on different weather patterns. And, and that hiking experience was one of the, biggest achievements of my life. It was huge. It was so incredible in so many ways. It was out in Colorado. But I distinctly remember being on the side of the mountain. There were these blasting gusts of 30-mile-an-hour winds that were just coming out of nowhere, just kaboom. And I'm on the side of the mountain, and it's hiking, not climbing, but it got really steep. And so I had to get down on all fours, hands and knees. And I'm gripping into this loose rock, trying not to get blasted off the side of this mountain at about 13,000 feet in elevation. And I remember in my head thinking, I'm not telling Mom and Dad this story till I'm home. But they let me do it. They didn't try and stop me. And, this is the same kid
Probably
who
also couldn't stop you because you're a full-grown adult.
Well, they couldn't. And I think they know that too. They recognize that too. But they also very genuinely, even recently, they're just talking about different changes and decisions in my life. I had a long conversation with one of my parents about something. And at the end, my mom just said, Chris, your dad and I trust you that you're going to do the right thing, because we know that God is leading your life, and we know that you'll do the right thing.
That's a powerful moment.
Yeah. And they've affirmed me more and more. This has happened in different things, like going on Haiti mission, which is, of course, both of you, it's dangerous. There is a danger in it. And so, to go from being that same kid who, wasn't allowed to go past the block in the neighborhood to this, is is this the same person? Is this the same parents? But that for me is an illustrative example of how my parents most certainly have a healthy fear for my life, and I see that, and they acknowledge it too. But I see how in their life they've learned how over time that gradually has to transition from an unhealthy worrying and an anxiety to something much more powerful, and for them something riskier, which is to actually entrust my life to the Lord, to providence, and put faith in my own decision making. To your earlier point,
yeah, I was going to say they're probably not worried about the providence part. It's more your decision making. I mean, not you. I'm saying in parents,
No, but they did have to struggle with providence too. I think they did, but no, I think it is primarily
if you talk to your parents, they'd probably say, "Oh no, the Lord's good. We're worried about you."
Yeah.
No, but we probably need to do something different, more extended on the fears and risks associated with parenting. Probably with a mom present who's going to be like, "You guys are idiots. You don't know anything. You've never had any kids. You don't know what it feels like." That kind of thing. So
I do want to just end with a couple questions. Is when it comes to fear, I think one of the challenges I've seen is people wanting to the fear of even facing it. Of the consequences of like coming in touch with your fear. How do you kind of help people like even just like face your fear, you know, like if it's a fear of failure or fear of rejection? Because I think many times we even don't deal with it because we don't want to face it. So how do you guys help, or, you know, a person who to face it? Because I think that is an important step, right? Of facing it, naming it, and then, you know, having a healthy relationship with it and not letting cripple you.
Yeah, we've talked about some of it already. Like some of the things you've said, Anthony, like naming the fear, facing it through exposure, like you mentioned, Father Thomas, trying to understand it better, to learn how to manage it. I think one word that I might add to the mix is learning how to shrink your fears, like to make them smaller, literally.
More proportionate.
Yeah. What about you, Father?
Well, one thing that I like to walk people through and walk myself through sometimes is the worst case scenarios, you know, because sometimes you know what you're afraid of. Like, okay, let's say I have to give a presentation in front of my team or something like that, or my bosses, and I know I'm afraid of that. So, but what's the real threat that the fear is trying to protect me from?
Mm.
What is that worst case scenario? And a lot of times, more often than not, when you examine that worst case scenario, you realize, you know, I'm not actually, that threat wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Like I could see myself pivoting from that and getting back on my feet and learning from it and stuff like that. So it can be helpful. The problem is, even once you think that through and you're at peace, you know, that doesn't mean the fear will go away, because, you know, like you said, you know, what happens up over here is not necessarily what happens, you know, back there in a sense. And so it can take some time to internalize those kinds of things, but I think that can be helpful.
Mm.
And then, so once you, I guess I also wanted to ask about the, you know, the words of Jesus and what the Christian vision of fear offers to a person in terms of like facing that fear and overcoming it. You know, the words of Jesus, do not be afraid, or the words of John Paul II, do not be afraid. How does that help us, in a way, transform our fears?
Yeah, we're not meant to just hide. I think that's the key thing. It's like, well, like, and when you think about the broad view on life, of your own life, it's like, well, maybe I should just hide, and that way at least nothing bad will happen to me. And that is not what the Lord has in store for anyone.
Right.
And so when you hear Jesus saying, do not be afraid, it's like, okay, it's time to, you know, take those steps to come out of hiding, to share the gifts that you have, actually the gift that you are, with the world. Like Jesus saying, nobody takes a lamp and puts it under a bushel basket, right? But it has to be set somewhere nice and high so that it can give light to the whole house.
Mm.
And that is, and Jesus says that in the context of, you are the light of the world. So we're not meant, no one is meant to be under a bushel basket. And I think allowing those words to transform our heart can expose places where we've been hiding out of fear, where we've been paralyzed by fear, where, you know, we just, we've gotten used to avoidance because of fear, and then to find the courage inside to actually take those risks and to step out and to share the goodness of God with the world.
Many years ago, there was a mentor of mine who counseled me, do not be afraid to taste life. And I always loved the way he said that. He was also very much influenced by John Paul II. And so I could definitely hear echoes of that. But what a beautiful idea. Like, don't be afraid to taste life. Life is actually worth savoring. It's worth living, like Fulton Sheen would say. Life is worth living. Like, don't be afraid of living. Don't be afraid to live, to taste life. Like, it's actually a beautiful thing. not a fearful, terrifying, ugly thing. Yeah.
I'm also remembering Father Jose's advice on here about do not be afraid of your inner world. That's also another beautiful space. But I don't know. What do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, no, I was, I mean, maybe similar thoughts too, but I think for me, another powerful place where the gospel speaks is that I'm not alone, that Jesus is with me. And so I think for me, that's always been, like, in a way, not crippling, but like, yeah, sometimes it can be crippling, is like, oh, I'm going to have to go through all of this alone, and then I'm going to face this alone. But then I think those words from Jesus saying, is it not I that have placed you in this heart? Is it not I that I'm going to be walking with you? Is it not I? And he reminds me of his faithfulness throughout my life. And in those places, then it gives me the courage then to face it and then move forward too. So I think those words of you are not alone, I think is particularly powerful for me from the Gospels, of facing my fear and moving forward from it.
Yeah, and to maybe land us back on the idea of God's providence. What you're sharing, Anthony, reminds me of my favorite chapter from Jesus of Nazareth by Pope Benedict, which is the chapter on the temptations. And when Pope Benedict is discussing the temptation of Jesus, where the devil tempts him to throw himself from the temple, from the Temple Mount, and God will catch him. Pope Benedict points out how the devil is, basically tempting Jesus to test God. And there might be different reasons why all of us feel that temptation to test God, but fear a lot of times is at the heart of that. Like, I've got to be sure, I've got to know. And Pope Benedict's response to that is that from the mountain of the temple, from the rooftop of the temple, Jesus would have been able to look out and see the mountain of Golgotha. And he would not throw himself from the Temple Mount to test God, but he would throw his life into the abyss of the Father's arms from the mountain of the cross in trust. And so, knowing that, all the rejections, all the unknowns, all the things that could go wrong, in the world's esteem, Jesus' life ended in failure. And yet at the end of all that, he threw himself in trust into the Father's arms, into the unknown, knowing that he would have his final security in the Father. Yeah, that's one of my favorite passages from Jesus of Nazareth. And to be honest, I think Pope Benedict lived that very personally. I think there were many unknowns that he had to face, many rejections, many difficult things. But in the end, he responded to fear, not by testing God, but by throwing himself into the arms of the Father in trust. So
beautiful. Oh, beautiful, guys. Thanks for our episode today. I really hope that this helps our listeners in living their life to the fullness and the potential of which they're called to be. So thank you, guys.
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inspirit podcast. Inspirit is an initiative of Amoris Christi, an apostolate dedicated to lay spiritual formation. For more information and to keep up to date, you can visit our website at amorischristi.org and follow us on social media.